Hello, I'm Brenda and this is Write Your Story. In this video, I'm going to do a book review on the memoir How Dare the Sunrise by Sandra Uwiringiyimana. I got to kind of pluck up the courage to say her last name. It's a good long last name, Sandra Uwiringiyimana, and her book How Dare the Sunrise. So we're going to look at a compelling opening chapter where she hooks the reader, memoir writing techniques that she makes use of, and in this one we're going to look at flashback, and then I'm going to look at what I've gleaned from the book and what the purpose has been for her to write her book. We are always looking for a compelling opening chapter, and Sandra does not disappoint. She plunges us into the Gatumba Massacre. It's August 2004, Burundi. It's a UN-sponsored refugee camp, and the rebels come in to attack the people who are looking for refuge there. These are primarily, if not exclusively, Banyamulenge minority tribe from the Congo, and they have been discriminated against for, according to Sandra and what she shares, more than 300 years. In the Congo, they are not regarded as Congolese. They are regarded as Rwandan. They look different, they have different shaped nose, and they were constantly persecuted. And so in this opening chapter, we are in the midst of this attack on the refugee camp. She's 10 years old, she's with her mother and her 6-year-old sister Deborah in a tent when the rebels attack. It's a compelling, strong, upsetting, disturbing attack. Things that children should never see, things that adults should never experience, something that should never happen to anybody. And in the story, Sandra shares how she sees her mother and her sister of 6 years old, Deborah, being gunned down, and how she ends the chapter with a gun to her head, expecting to be shot and executed, murdered, killed, just like so many other people have been that she has witnessed that evening. That's how chapter 1 ends. It's a compelling chapter, it's a disturbing chapter, and as you turn the page to chapter 2, we get a breather, and we're going to need it after chapter 1. And the breather we get in chapter 2 is how Sandra then uses flashback to take us back to the beginning of her story. She plunges us in the opening chapter into this massacre. Chapter 2, we turn the page, disturbed, upset, and we get this breather to now step back, go back to the beginning of her story where she explains who her family is. We are already invested in this family because we've seen her mother and her daughter, her 6-year-old daughter, being killed. We have another young girl who's sharing the story and telling us what's happened, and we are curious, intrigued, wanting to know how they ended up being in the camp that night. And so she starts with flashback to build her story, to tell us about her family, to introduce us into who they are as a family, her mother, her father, Deborah, her other sisters. Now we already know that there's tragedy that's coming their way, and so there's a poignancy in coming to know this family, in reading Sandra's story because of how she structured her memoir. And then in chapter 3, she, together with her co-writer Abigail Pester, do something really fabulous to hook the reader. It was so sublime, I actually wanted to stand up and applaud because it was outstanding. And this is what they do to hook the reader at the end of chapter 3. Chapter 1, we've had the massacre. Her mother and her sister have been gunned down. Chapter 2, we get a bit of a breather and she starts to develop the story. Chapter 3, she expands it. But then in end of chapter 3, she drops this clue that just had me going, what? And it's this. She starts to describe her mother at the end of the chapter, and characteristics of her mother, tells us a bit about her mother and the type of woman she was, and uses the past tense. And I'm expecting that. I'm expecting her to describe her mother as she was, because she was killed in chapter 1. As I turned the page, coming to the end of this chapter, she switches immediately from past tense to present tense to refer to something her mother has always said to her every time she's had to complain, or every time something has happened. Her mother always says this to her. And I'm realizing that her mother is still alive. she, in just switching tenses, has dropped the clue at the end of chapter 3 that her mother is still alive. And now I am hook, line, and sinker going to read this book to find out how she was reconciled with her mother, how her mother survived that attack, how this family got back together. And I'm now so invested in this family, I knew then I would read this book to its very last word. At various times in her book, Sandra explains why she's written the story. She's very open with the fact that she's written the story to give herself a voice, to describe her own life, to describe the history of her family and her tribe, the Banyamulengis, to not have other people tell their story for them. She wants to remember her sister Deborah, who was killed in the Gatumba Massacre. She doesn't want that people forget that this Gatumba Massacre happened and that people the rebels, that is, that those people got away from any type of justice that needed to come because of this killing, because of this murdering rampage. That is how she explains it, that's how she depicts it, and that's what she's wanting, is justice for these people and to not be forgotten. She wants a voice for the invisible and really the forgotten. Part of the story then becomes how Sandra and her family are given refugee status in the USA, and they go to live in the States as immigrants and refugees. And the story goes on to explain what that experience has been like for her. And I think as a reader, for me, it became really important again to read a book that takes a refugee story, which we so often just blanket as one story for all people, and honed it down to one family, their heartache, their heartbreak, their hardship, their struggle, the difficulties that they have gone through that I can't begin to imagine, and then makes it one story that is pivotal in coming to have compassion and empathy for the struggles that some people go through. And I really felt that that is really one of the gems of this book, is that it changes the reader. It broadens the reader's perspective by actually telling the story of one family. So I highly recommend this memoir. I recommend reading it for its memoir techniques that are so well illustrated. I recommend reading it to know more about the Gatumba Massacre and the struggles this particular family, who are survivors and sufferers of this massacre, have had to endure. And I also suggest reading it in order to broaden our perspective and to engage our empathy for people who are refugees and are needing to live in another country. So do read How Dare the Sunrise. And if you're wanting to know more about how to write a memoir, the techniques of memoir writing, storytelling, the craft of memoir, and all the wonderful joys that it brings in writing memoir, then do subscribe, hit the notification bell, and you'll get notification of the next video.